Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa van Dijk, and in today's video I want to show you something I noticed after tracking my diet and acne every single day for over 2 years. Now, what I found was that the foods commonly described as acne triggers perfectly overlapped with the breakouts I used to get. And when I looked closer, there was a 100% match. Every food that consistently triggered the worst breakouts was high or very high in potassium. I did not notice this until recently because to me it looked random, but it was not random. There was a consistent pattern I was only able to see because I had documented everything for so long. And once I saw it, I realized these foods were not separate triggers. I think what they were doing was exposing the same underlying imbalance, which had to do with salt, potassium, and fluid retention. And I want to start with the common acne trigger foods, because this is where it gets really interesting and where the pattern becomes much easier to see. These are only the most common examples, but the same pattern showed up every time. So we have cow's milk, ice cream, cocoa or chocolate, potatoes or fries, oats and oat milk, pistachios, pumpkin seeds, peanuts, and then things like lentils, chickpeas or even beans. And dried fruit, like for example, dried apricots. And what makes this so interesting is that this list contains both foods that are considered unhealthy and foods that are considered healthy. Ice cream, chocolate, and fries are usually seen as obvious acne foods. But then you have foods like oats, oat milk, pistachios, pumpkin seeds, peanuts, lentils, chickpeas, beans, and dried apricots, which are usually seen as healthy foods. So this was not just an unhealthy food pattern. There was something else connecting both sides, and that is what I was looking for, because I had reactions from both healthy and unhealthy foods, and that never made sense to me. And I think this is also why I did not notice it for so long. I was so focused on individual triggers. With one food I thought maybe it was hormones. With another maybe pesticides. With another maybe the fats. Or maybe it is too much sugar. Or maybe legumes are just a bad category because of all the plant protection compounds in them. Which is also something you often read or hear. So essentially every food gets its own explanation. And when you think like that, it always leads to another food category being labeled as good or bad, instead of looking at the pattern behind all of them. But when I looked at my own tracking, I stopped looking at the category and started looking at what these foods actually had in common. And the one thing they all had in common was that they were high or extremely high in potassium, especially based on how these foods are normally eaten and the amounts we usually consume. For example, milk is high in potassium, and most people are not drinking 100 milliliters. They are drinking a full glass, or sometimes even more. Cocoa and dark chocolate are high in potassium. Potatoes are high in potassium, and we do not only eat plain potatoes, we also eat fries. Oats and oat milk can be high in potassium, especially if you eat a full bowl of oats. Pistachios are extremely high in potassium, and pumpkin seeds, peanuts, lentils, chickpeas, and beans are high as well. And dried fruit is also very high in potassium. And in general, it is very easy to eat a lot more than you realize because the water is removed and everything becomes much more concentrated. So at first it looked like high potassium foods were causing my acne because whenever I added them, I kind of could expect more breakouts a couple of days later. But that is where I think my mistake happened, because if you only look at the timing, it looks simple. I eat the food, then the breakout happens, so I thought, okay, well, that food caused the breakout. So I became very selective, put those foods on the list and avoided them. And it worked, like the typical elimination approach that gets recommended so often. Problem solved. But after a while, I had so many foods on the list that my diet became very narrow. And yes, breakout-wise, it worked. I have a few videos on my channel where I showed the diet that effectively solved that part of the issue. But it was kind of like treating a pimple on the surface with skincare. You can calm it down, but if the reason it keeps coming back is still there, then you are only managing the symptom. And that is what avoiding those foods became for me. It helped me avoid the reaction, but it did not explain why those foods were reactive in the first place. So yes, the narrow diet worked as a temporary fix, but it was not the actual solution to the deeper problem. But what I think really happened here is that those foods were exposing the state my body was already in. And that state was a water retention state, where my body was already holding on to more fluid because sodium was too high compared to potassium. I never really noticed it because that was not what I was looking for. I was so focused on specific trigger foods and on the established acne pattern of hormones, oil, dead skin cells and bacteria that I missed the fluid balance part completely. But sodium and potassium work together in the body, and what they do is that they help regulate fluid balance. So when sodium is too high compared to potassium, the body can hold on to more fluid. And because modern diets are often so high in sodium and lower in potassium-rich whole foods, this can happen very easily. And when that happens, the tissues can become much more swollen and more pressurized and more reactive. So if the body is already in that state, then it is just logical that high potassium foods can create a more noticeable shift compared to the one that is lower. And it is not happening because the food is bad. It just correlates with high potassium, so it is not a bad thing. But because potassium is involved in correcting the imbalance, the correction is not smooth. So the body tries to regulate it by shifting fluid. And what I mean by that is that the body starts moving water around differently. Pressure changes, and then the skin becomes more reactive. It is kind of like a pressure break for the skin, I would say, and then the breakout appears. But the high potassium food looks like the trigger and it gets blamed, and when it is removed, it balances again, causing no problems because the shift is simply avoided. So in my experience, the deeper issue was the balance between salt and potassium that was already off before I ate the food, which was constantly being pushed by too much sodium and too few potassium-rich whole foods. And then the food gets blamed as if it is the root cause. And I think this is also why doctors or studies often say the food acne link is inconsistent or that it only happens for some people, because in a way that is true. The food will not act the same way in every body if the underlying balance is different. And this is where I think they are either wrong or they are simply overlooking the most important part, because the food is not acting alone. It depends on the state the body is already in before that food comes in. And what is really happening is that the food is revealing the imbalance. And I'm convinced of that, because the opposite side of the pattern was just as clear for me. The foods that felt calming for my skin were not random either. Cabbage, lettuce, cucumber, blueberries, blackberries, macadamia avocado oil, macadamia nuts, pecans, eggs, minced beef and lamb. These foods were much easier for me to tolerate. And I never thought they had some magical anti-acne property. I thought maybe they were simply cleaner foods or less contaminated, so I selected them very carefully because I did not want to let go of the ideas I had at the time. But now it is much clearer to me that they were calming because they put less pressure on the fluid balance. They did not force a strong fluid shift. They did not push the body into a big correction. So the skin stayed calmer. But that does not mean the lower potassium foods were the final solution. They just kind of helped calm down the reaction, or as I see it now, they did not cause it in the first place. But what's more important is that they did not represent the full correction that was needed to solve the actual problem. Because the long-term goal should not be to avoid potassium. It should actually be the opposite, which is to improve the balance between salt and potassium, because these foods all point into the same direction, which is an internal imbalance created by too much sodium compared to potassium. So instead of only removing more foods, the real solution is to gradually lower the amount of sodium in the diet and bring potassium back through whole foods. so the body can correct the imbalance without creating such a strong reaction. And for me, that was the part that changed everything. Once I corrected that pattern, the foods that used to look like triggers stopped acting the same way, and they did not cause the same reaction anymore. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!